Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really delighted to welcome to Leeds Trinity Journalism and Media Week someone who I've been really looking forward to interviewing. So she's an editor, a journalist, an author, a broadcaster, until recently editor-in-chief of Empire magazine. Before that, editor of Time Out in New York. So 21 years of experience in magazine and newspaper publishing. Fantastic track record, Stylist Magazine, The Guardian, Grazia L, and many, many more. So Terri White, a huge welcome to Leeds Trinity. Absolutely delighted to have you here. So as I mentioned, until recently you were with Empire magazine. You're now working on your second book and writing for The Big Issue and lots of others, as you were telling me earlier. I would like to talk about that decision to leave Empire a bit more in a bit, but can you start by taking us back to the beginning of your career and what made you want to be in magazine journalism?
Well, and it was, I should say, first of all, hello, and thank you ever so much for having me. It's an absolute thrill to be here. That's the loudest kind of pop I've ever heard. It's fine. So I specifically wanted to work in magazines, and that's because when I was growing up, I was obsessed with magazines like Smash Hits. Old people always come in, don't they, and talk about things like Smash Hits and Enemy and all those magazines. And Just 17 when I was a kid. And I used to babysit and save up my money and go and get them every week from the newsagents. And I think what it was is that magazines at their very best are an amazing gang. And they welcome you into that gang. And I was a pretty lonely kid. And I think through the pages of magazines, I thought I'd found my gang, and I thought, oh my God, wouldn't it be amazing if I could do that for a living? But I didn't know anyone in London, didn't know anyone in the industry. So after university, actually, while I was at university, I wrote off to every magazine I could find and asked them if I could do work experience. And they all said no, apart from Marie Claire, who said, you can be an intern on our reception desk. Those are the old days where receptionists had their own interns. And I sat on the reception desk for 6 weeks and wasn't allowed into the actual office where the journalists were. But I did get back into the feature side the summer after. And then I applied for a job as soon as I was done with my final exams, actually before I'd graduated, which was as a PA and editorial assistant at Later magazine, which was kind of like an older men's magazine. They used to say it was for grown-up loaded, essentially. Okay. And yeah, that was really how I started out in magazines.
Yeah, because I'm a huge magazine fan. I subscribe to several magazines. I just love the kind of feel and the physicality of them. But, you know, they have struggled recently, and some of the ones even you've worked for have gone digital or folded or, you know, how do you see the future of magazine industry?
I think the really easy thing that people say all the time is magazines are dead or are dying. People have been saying that since I joined the industry in the year 2000. And there was a boom period. I mean, 2000 to pretty much, 2007 and 8, there were launches every single month, massive multi-million-pound launches. There is a reality that the medium is not kind of the most popular medium in this day and age. But I think there are lots of really exciting brands that will always have a print magazine at its heart. So, for example, Empire, I absolutely do not see a day when Empire exists, as a website and as a podcast, but doesn't exist as a magazine. The magazine is the beating heart of Empire. And to what you're speaking to, the readers love the tangible nature of holding something in their hands, the way we've paced the magazine, the rhythm. You have a completely different experience online, but the print experience is to be savoured and to be loved. And I still love print media. I think there's this sense that, people either read magazines or go on websites or listen to podcasts. No, we don't. We're all like human beings. We all do a bit of all of those things. I think the challenge for most publishers is working out the business model. So it used to be a very simple business model, which is print magazines would be mostly circulation, which was fairly robust price, and then a bit of advertising. And what we haven't yet worked out, I think, is a proper digital kind of business model, or podcasts, because, you know, we took one of the Empire podcasts, we started to charge for it, and that showed the potential for people to pay for podcasts. But there's all kinds of challenges around pod and digital. They've often been free, and people expect them sometimes to stay free. So I think the challenge really lies in how do you properly build out a model that sustains a magazine brand over multiple platforms and probably charges the consumer at multiple points, not just the print mag.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, there's been such an explosion of podcasts in particular, hasn't there? And it's kind of how you can monetize all of that, really. So you chose to leave your job at the helm of Empire magazine after your son was born. You found yourself juggling really long working days, up to 19 hours. You just weren't seeing your little boy. Talk us through how you feel about that decision that you've said that you don't feel women in this day and age should have to make a choice like that.
No, and it was incredibly difficult. I remember when I became pregnant, I burst into tears to my boyfriend and said, I'm going to lose my job. And he was like, what are you talking about? Why would you lose your job? And I was like, I couldn't, even at that point, I found it hard to see how I could do that job and take on the additional responsibilities of being a parent. And that is because, you know, Empire has a small team. I was doing a lot of work personally, as were the rest of the team. And that meant a lot of overworking, but just more hours than are sustainable. And, you know, I think that's a challenge for magazines generally. I think as we're talking about, these challenging times have come. I think it's harder to get resource, it's harder to get investment, and existing staff are asked to do more. And it was, you know, I think I'd worked 3 19-hour days in a row, and I just said, you know, I can't do this. And there's a couple of things that kind of, I'm always wary about talking about it too much, because I don't think women should be the ones having to constantly have the conversation about how we juggle it. Oh, tell me how you juggle it. Like, let's ask the men in the room, not you men, don't worry, I'm not going to ask you. But the conversation has to be about more than women and mothers. And also it's about quality of life. So I said on a podcast when I talked about leaving Empire, it shouldn't just be about me being able to see my son. If I've got a 24-year-old lad who works for me, wants to go out to the pub or to the pictures or see his girlfriend, he should be able to do those things as well. It's about a quality of life outside of work and a manageable workload. But, you know, it was an incredibly difficult decision. I was pretty much heartbroken by it because it was my dream job. But I didn't see any other solution, quite honestly. And so that was the decision I made.
So, I mean, do you think things might improve going forward? I mean, it's a really difficult sort of thorny issue, as you say. Where does the resource come from, in a way?
I don't know, because I think publishers speak a lot with the intent of making things better, and they talk very publicly a lot about things like mental health and support around flexi working. But unless you back up those statements of intent with investment, nothing's going to happen. Because they say, oh, work flexibly. Well, okay, I'd like to be able to leave at 6 o'clock every night so I can go home and see my son. What happens to the work that then isn't done? There's just, I think nobody's kind of drilled down into the granular level of how do we make this happen. I think it's all very well and good to have aims, but until you actually put practical resource behind making that a reality, then I think it's always going to be a challenge.
Yeah, and there has been always this sort of idea that journalism, you work long hours, and you know, it's just how it is. Anyway, I hope you guys will change that. Maybe
this is probably like scaring you lot off. I'm like, this is meant to get you excited about magazines, right? I have to just say, I still think editing Empire is the best job in the world. Let me tell you, like, that's why it was heartbreaking to leave. The job I did before that, Time Out New York, was one of the most challenging and exciting jobs I've ever done. And both those jobs were in recent times. So what you'll often hear is people talking about the good old days of magazines. The good old days aren't over. The party isn't over. There are still really exciting jobs on really exciting magazines all over the world. It's still a very vibrant, buoyant industry. It's very agile in this country. British magazines respond quickly. They innovate. I think they're bold and brave in a way that, for example, big magazines in America find it difficult to be because of how conservative the country and advertisers can be. So I still think magazines are like absolutely a dream career and a dream job, and the jobs are still there to be had.
So, you've given a really good insight into how it was being a woman and a mum in that industry. How do you think, what about the way women, and powerful women in particular, are often portrayed by the media? Carrie Johnson is, she gets these labels like Mad Queen, Princess Nuts. Is that something that a man in a similar position would be labelled with in the same way?
No, and I think it can be hard to win as a woman. So I always felt like I had to be more hardworking and tougher than the men I worked in men's magazines for a lot of my career, and that I should work harder, show I was more committed, be tougher than a lot of the men. And you receive these signals to exist within a male world, which essentially is be a bit more like a man. And then people will say, that you're hard, or you're not warm. This is often things people, oh, she's not very warm. It's like, this is a job. We're not, pals down the pub. So I think it can be difficult to potentially be yourself and bring all of you to a job. And I think thought I had to be a bit harder and a bit more resilient and be prepared to work longer and harder to kind of prove myself. And I feel like that's shifted. I think there are so many high profile women who are showing different ways it can be done. That isn't an imitation of how a bloke would do it. And I think that's been really helpful. I feel like that was definitely probably more of an issue in the noughties.
So you've written, Terri, very powerfully about your sort of life story, being sexually abused as a child, your mum also a victim of domestic abuse, your memoirs, Coming Undone, talk about how you kind of came undone in New York through alcohol and pills and things like that. I'm going to read a little bit, if that's all right, because I found it very powerful, very moving. So, on the good nights, I lose things. My favourite faux fur coat, my red leather gloves, my bank card, my phone. On the bad nights, I lose more. Chunks of memory, all the feeling in my hands and toes, my loosening hold on sanity. And I'm just wondering kind of how you look back on all of that now. You're a mum of a small child yourself. And how important is it to not let that kind of define who you are in some way?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I'd always kept that part of myself and my life completely separate to work, because again, I felt like you had to be a certain image to work in magazines. I was from a working class background, and fought really hard for that not to reveal itself. So I was always really conscious of how I spoke, my references, how I dressed. I felt like there were clues all over me that, we'd grown up basically in poverty. And I spent most of my career trying to hide that, trying to make sure nobody discovered kind of how dysfunctional our house had been growing up, as you talked about, both physical and sexual violence. And there was a period where you were very much, keep the professional and the personal very far apart. They're completely different parts of your personhood and your life. I feel like with the conversations opening up around mental health, there's been much more of a effort and I suppose a nod to people to be able to kind of be a bit more yourself. And so writing the book, I think, nobody knew about any of those things. I wrote about the domestic violence once before, not until I was in my mid-30s. I really veered away from personal writing. And by the time I wrote the book, I was kind of keen to reconcile those bits of myself, because actually hiding the fact that I'd been struggling with serious mental health issues for pretty much the entirety of my career was quite exhausting, and continually trying to make sure that it never slipped out. And so I just thought, I'll write it all down in this book that everyone will be able to read. And it was slightly terrifying. And somebody said to me, aren't you worried that people won't want to employ you because will they trust you with their magazine if you've been seriously mentally unwell and have, I was sectioned when I lived in New York. And I just kind of, it sounds like a cliche, but I kind of figured if that kind of thing is going to make them kind of doubt my skills as an editor, which I think I've proven over and over again, then that isn't the place I want to work. And that's not somewhere I would be welcome anyway. It was incredibly exposing because everybody in your industry now knows these things about you. And it also coincided with probably the most successful time of my career. So Time Out New York, I redesigned it with my team. We relaunched it. We took it free. We won awards. It was like a massive job with a big team.
You're at the top of your game.
Yeah.
Really. Yeah.
And then obviously on the other side of it, that was when I also ended up getting sectioned. So kind of, I think trying to keep those things apart really didn't work for me and doesn't work generally. And it was only actually in being able to bring them back together that I feel like I was able to be a slightly healthier, more, I hate the word authentic because people overuse it and use it incorrectly, but I'm going to say it, be a more authentic person.
Lovely. Funnily enough, that's a message we've had earlier today as well, from another female panelist. So I echo that definitely. So you've gone freelance now. You've taken the decision to step into that world. How is that? And we were saying, weren't we, earlier that with maybe a decline in some staff jobs, that's perhaps something that our students are going to have to think more about. So any tips for them in terms of that world?
Yeah, it's weird because I worked in staff jobs for basically 21 years, and the thought of being freelance put the fear of God into me. I like being in a team. I like being in this gang. But also, there's a lot of insecurity, a lot of instability. So I've really enjoyed it so far. It's been, 6 weeks, 7 weeks that I've been doing it. I'm writing mainly. As you say, I'm working on my first novel. And there's also an adaptation of my book for TV in the works, which is really exciting. So I think, what I've probably learned from my career is to have other things going on at the same time. So the book, I'm very glad I wrote the book when I did, and it's given me options now. But some of the journalists who come through in the last 5 years who have been kind of really successful quite quickly have developed freelance portfolio careers. So with staff jobs not being in the kind of big supply that they used to be, people straight out of the gate, getting radio slots, getting bylines on both digital and print, magazines, newspapers, also doing podcasting. And they've built themselves a really rich career that doesn't depend on one magazine, which is great because if that magazine folds or you're made redundant, that can be very difficult. So actually, having other things that you do entirely under your own steam, whether that's you make your own podcast and publish it, whether you're already writing for somebody, getting all of those things going as quickly as possible so that if you do get a staff job, great. But if not, you've still got other things that you can build your career upon.
And are you pitching stuff to people, or are they approaching you, or a bit of a mix?
I haven't yet. I should. But yes, mainly approaching me just because of the work I've done before. But yeah, the I suppose the more sustainable long-term view is pitching stuff I really want to write. So there's a story I've wanted to write for a few years that I actually did pitch last week to a newspaper, which has been accepted, which is something I feel really strongly about, and I'm going to probably spend the next couple of months working on. So it's probably more things like that, weighty reporting and profile writing and stuff like that.
So definitely some pluses to kind of working for yourself and being able to work on the projects you really want to work on.
I mean, seeing my child is a big, it actually is a big plus. I started to do that weird thing, where I've only ever seen this in movies where you turn up at the dad turns up at the cot and the baby's asleep and they just stare at them in the darkness. I started to do that a lot and I was like, my God, I'm the dad who misses baseball, aren't I? I'm the dad who's like, sorry, Billy. Sorry, I missed your home run, Billy. I was in a business meeting. So that's not happening anymore, which is good. But yeah, it does enable you to kind of, if there's something you're really into, to kind of really dig into that. And just to have things under your own steam, it's quite liberating, to be honest, not to be part of a bigger corporation with, layers of management and all of that. There's a freedom and an excitement to it that kind of took me by surprise, if I'm honest. So yeah,
exciting. So yeah, you mentioned that your memoirs, Coming Undone, has been sort of optioned for a TV adaptation. So I want to know, who would you like to see playing you, and what else can you tell us about it?
Well, I can't say anything about anything. Oh God, I know. I'm sorry, but I've signed an NDA that will literally get me sued. Yes, I can't. Oh my God, I'm trying to think what I can say. What can I say? Oh, I mean, Bad Wolf have optioned it, which is public knowledge. Who do Discovery of Witches, I Hate Susie, His Dark Materials. Yeah. They're brilliant, led by the incredible Jane Tranter, who is an incredible senior woman in TV. So I'm really happy that it's gone with them. I think it's really important, given the nature of what the book deals with, that it's handled in a really sensitive manner. That was really key for me. But hopefully some news quite soon.
Oh, I know. Be very cagey about that. Gosh. Okay.
I'm usually on the other side of this, trying to make somebody spill. So this is like, feels very uncomfortable to me.
Okay. So, well, just before we go to some questions, you know, these guys are all starting off as journalists. You know, what do you say to them in terms of sort of your career as a journalist and what they, you know, the excitement of it, I suppose, really? And
I mean, really, just to echo what I said, which is I still genuinely believe it's the most exciting world to work in. I think British magazines are some of the best in the world, the way they operate, the way they innovate. You know, I remember in New York trying to get some sex column through, and the tamest thing, and it was like, oh, that advertiser's not going to be happy with that, and all of these restrictions and conservative, whatever that word is. But in British magazines, you know, they are willing to like push the envelope. If you've got a great idea and you can show a fairly simple model to monetize it, most publishers will let you have a run at that. So we launched Pilot, which is the TV spin-off of Empire, which now is a massively successful podcast. That was just because we thought, why is nobody doing anything just specifically on amazing cinematic telly? And we experimented with the print mag for a bit. We were looking at a digital thing, and then actually the bit of it that's really got traction is the podcast, which is now monetized through sponsorship. So I think it still is an industry that rewards ideas and rewards innovation. And I think the people that will survive in magazines and really thrive are the people who are not scared to put investment behind big ideas. And I see that happening in the industry. And that's what makes it exciting. And, you know, I just think there are so many brilliant journalists still working in magazines, so many amazing creative directors. And I'd still massively recommend it too. If I had a child of your age, which might be possible if by my maths, but if I would absolutely tell that child to go and work in magazines.
Terrific. Great. Thank you very much. Okay. So, all right. Got an online question coming. Oh, right. Okay. So this is from Humphrey. What was an issue of Empire or any other magazine you were especially proud of being involved with?
Empire, there were a couple of really clear ones. So during the pandemic, obviously, no movies being made, all sets were closed down, no movies being released, all cinemas were shut. A few obviously still coming out via digital distribution, but none of the big hitters. And so we had to really take a look at what Empire did, mainly because of all of the features we had lined up all fell out immediately. But I think we produced some of our best issues and most robust journalism during that time. And there was one issue in particular, which was Edgar Wright did a special issue with us where he basically gathered together 40 directors and actors from across Hollywood, including, James Cameron, Jordan Peele, Steven Spielberg, Spike Lee, and he got them to write a thing for us talking about their favorite ever moment in the cinema. And we were just sat there and you're seeing, somebody goes, oh, Spike Lee sent his in last night, and somebody else is going, Spielberg, oh no, Spielberg hasn't sent his in yet. And when you're having that conversation in the office, it's kind of, you still feel that magic, because I don't believe there's any other magazine in the world that could have pulled that off with Edgar other than Empire. And that's how close the relationship between the Empire brand and filmmakers is. That was a bit of magic. But more than that, it was the reader response. So we sold out that issue. We had to reprint it, which is basically unheard of these days. And people were writing to me saying, you know, they were moved to tears reading the magazine because it spoke to their own deep, deep love of cinema. And that was our job really as Empire, to kind of harness and nurture that connection and that love. And that issue did it kind of better than any issue I'd ever worked on.
Brilliant. Thank you. Great question. Okay. Yeah, we'll just let... Oh. Okay, Noah?
Hi. So just kind of going back to a bit when you were at Empire, because that's kind of like the goal. When you're like looking for, I don't know how close you were involved in it, but when you're like looking for talent and stuff, where are you kind of mainly sourcing that from? And what would you say like sets someone apart as, because, you know, like everyone writes like film reviews all the time now, everyone tweets their opinion. Yeah. What kind of sets someone apart as someone you're like, oh, maybe they could actually, you know, do this for a living?
Yeah, and we would, you know, junior or entry-level jobs at Empire are very rare, and they are very rare at a lot of magazines these days. It's actually just come up, by the way, there's a news editor job going at Empire. If anybody wants to apply for it, this is the job to go for. And what it always was, it was what they wrote in the email or the cover letter and their conviction around film. So it wasn't necessarily about being a cinephile. I always hated the slight snobbery that could sometimes go on in the olden days with Empire. It was about a proper love of film and a real passion and conviction in the way they articulated that. So it was all about the writing for me. It was all about the clarity of the idea and the passion of the expression. That they didn't have to come as kind of a fully formed writer, but I could always see something in those emails and letters that set that person apart. And that's really what it is. And if somebody's got bylines, that's great and all of that, but it's this kind of magic you're looking for. And just people who really, really want to work for it. The amount of like covering letters I got that said, hello, sir or madam, even though my name would always be in the, and then they'd cut and paste something that was clearly for like a caravan magazine or something, and they just cut and paste it across for Empire. And so you really just, when those applications come in where people have really spent the time on it, know the magazine really well, and have a fundamental kind of passion for your subject, that goes a massively long way already.
Get that application in now. The huge film buff, yeah.
Hi. You said a lot about how you initially, earlier in your career, kept your professional and then your private life like distinctly separate. If you did it over again, obviously now it's all out there, would you have done that earlier? Would you have like talked about the more personal side of things earlier on in your career if you did it all over again? And with that, since you've spoken about more of the personal stuff, have you had many people sort of ask questions that are a bit sort of past the line and quite intrusive to the point where you're like, I've written a book, but you have no right to ask that?
Yeah, both really good questions. So I don't think I would do it any differently in terms of, that's like my own voice speaking back at me. That's like my idea of hell, by the way. I probably would have been a little bit more open just in how I was and in the stuff I revealed to colleagues and things like that. But in terms of writing either a book or personal articles, I don't think I would have done. My concern for a lot of journalists starting out, especially for women, is there's a trend for what they call confessional pieces, right? And I think there is a sense in that's what a lot of female journalists become known for, which is absolutely fine. I've written those pieces. A lot of those pieces are great. But there's a sense of a thing being expected of a lot of women that isn't always expected of men. You know, share your trauma with us, tell us this, trade on this. And I think when you choose to do it, and it's entirely within your power and you're doing it for reasons that make sense to you, absolutely 100%. But I think starting off there can be very difficult. And I think journalism fundamentally is about telling other people's stories. So I think it was only after about a decade and a half of doing that I felt comfortable to tell mine. And I was glad I was a bit older, because I dread to think what I'd have written when I was 21. I would not want that following me around on the internet for the rest of my life. So I think having a time to kind of prove myself as a journalist and have that context, then you're putting personal pieces out into that. And I think I think it just made more sense for me, certainly. And your question is funny because I interviewed Emily Ratajkowski, I can never say her surname, Ratajkowski, for Stylist, and we spoke just after the Robin Thicke allegations had leaked in a newspaper. And I asked her, I was going to ask her about it. And before I did, I said to her, I'm going to ask you some questions about this. If you don't want to talk about it, I need you to tell me. And I don't think I'd have done that before I wrote my book, because there was the thing when I was interviewed for newspapers and podcasts where a lot of people thought they could ask me anything because I'd shared this information. So why wouldn't I just talk about it? There's a real sense of any agency being kind of taken from me as soon as I put that information out into the world. And it's really meant a lot to me when people have said, is it okay to ask this? How do you feel about this? And because just because you've said it once doesn't mean you always have to say it over and over again, or that you no longer have any say in whether you talk about it or not. So that's really helped me as a journalist, I have to say, because I always think interviewing with consent is a very different thing. You're trained often to kind of try and get things out of people. But when I was speaking to her about something so deeply personal and traumatic, I felt like she should have agency in whether she actually wanted to talk about it or not.
Hi, Terri. I'm Darren, long-time listener, first-time caller. I'm just wondering if I could ask you, we've got one of your previous colleagues, James Dyer, coming tomorrow at Journalism Media Week. If there was one question that we needed to ask James Dyer tomorrow, what would it be?
I think it would be, James Dyer, why are you such a bell end? He'll know what it means.
Lovely, thank you.
You can just play that on a loop tomorrow. Very helpful.
So just on the theme of mental health, if you're feeling that self-doubt and that sadness, is it all right to just take a moment to clear your head and really feel it, or should you just quash it right away and just get on with what you're doing?
When you're in the act of writing, do you mean? Yeah.
When you've published your first couple of articles, film review perhaps, or something like that, and you've got a little bit of scrutiny on them because you made a mistake, because you perhaps haven't done your research properly or something like that, and you do get a bit of backlash perhaps, and you do feel a bit sad about it. What should you do about it?
I mean, my inclination in those moments is always to take a step away. I think we're told to kind of just barge through it and keep going and ignore it. I think, especially in the age of social media, if you feel the need to take a step back and be quiet for a bit, then you should absolutely do that. Because I think there's a slight difference in the way things are consumed now. When I first started out in magazines and things weren't published online, people would have to go and buy the magazine to read what you'd written. Now things get put online, shared on social, people pull bits out, and that can be very overwhelming, I think, if something gets a lot of response. I don't know if anybody saw Michaela Cole's incredible speech when she won the Emmy, and she basically said, I think I'm going to really ruin this, but basically said kind of, don't be afraid to step away and see what comes to you in the silence. And I think that's always a great thing, because I think when you're having success and you've been published, you always feel like you need to keep going and you're in this moment and you need to capitalize on it. I think it's often far healthier to, if you feel like you need to, just stop and take a breath and wait before you actually react.
Hiya. You've had a fantastic career so far. Is there anything that you haven't done yet in your career that you'd like to do at some point in the future?
Do you know what? Because I realised that Empire is going to be the last magazine I ever edit. Because there's no other magazine. I was trying to run through them all. There's no other magazine I want to edit. And that feels quite sad, because that's my career over with, which is sad. Oh, God. No, probably not. What I'd say is not in journalism. There are other things that interest me, screenwriting and stuff like that. But I think anything I ever wanted to do in magazines, I think I've been lucky enough to be able to do. And I think probably it'll be looking outside of magazines going forward.
Still storytelling though.
And storytelling is storytelling, right? Like I'm addicted to telling stories and to finding a way to harness language to tell it with most punch and empathy and compassion, and that's what really excites me, and I think that is present in lots and lots of places. Very good point.
Hi Terri. Just going to like before, when you're saying you working class background and you've had like, you know, domestic abuse, all this kind of stuff like that, and then working 19-hour days with like substance abuse and stuff like that, obviously that resonates with a lot of people because it's quite common, you know, working class, you have substance abuse issues, everything like that. What was like your epiphany moment? Was it your son, or was it something completely different, which was like, I don't want to do this anymore kind of thing?
Do you know what, like, here's the truth is there really isn't an epiphany moment, and I think that's what we're always taught, right? Especially with the 3-act narrative and the redemptive arc and all of that, we're told that there's going to be a moment where you go, ta-da, this is not the way I want to exist. That doesn't really happen. I think for me, it was more of a gradual thing. So when I worked and lived in New York, I was in a very bad place with my mental health. I was drinking too much. I was taking lots of prescription pills, and I shouldn't have lived in New York at that time of my life. It was a terrible combination, me in that city. And it became clear to me, you know, I went to, I was sectioned. I then went into AA and outpatient rehab. And loads of bad shit, sorry for the swearing, loads of bad shit happened after that. That wasn't the kind of rock bottom that we're told it will probably be. And I ended up leaving New York over a year later. And I had a gradual realization that I didn't think I could be happy in New York, that it wasn't the city that would allow me to be happy, or that I could be happy within. And I think that took a lot to admit, because we're told, you know, through movies and books and records, that New York is this incredible place that everybody wants to work in, that if you make it there, you can make it anywhere. All of those things you feel very powerfully. So walking away from it feels like madness. Like, why would you choose to leave somewhere that other people want to go? And so I moved home, and I just basically got better over the period of probably 2 years. And, you know, I had my first long-term relationship in about a decade. I then had my son. Neither of those things would have been possible had I still been in that place, but I had to get there myself. And I think there's often people will go to me, oh, was it because you like met a bloke and had a baby? It was like, if you think that meeting a man and having a baby is going to help your mental health, you've clearly done neither of those things. It was just a gradual thing for me. And I think one day I woke up and realized I didn't want to die anymore, and I'd wanted to die for pretty much my entire life. And I no longer did. And that was a moment of real kind of, just the moment when everything could be different, and therefore the work had to be done after that to make it so. But yeah, no, the dark answer to that question is the moment I decided I no longer wanted to die. Yeah, but you get my point. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. So you spoke in your book, and obviously just now, a lot about like drinking in New York and that culture. And I know there is kind of a stereotype in the industry that a lot of networking does happen over drinks at parties. Do you think that's still the case? And how kind of difficult is it to navigate those situations when you don't want to drink?
It definitely used to be the case. I mean, we were talking earlier, when I first moved to London, I probably learned as much down the pub or at parties as I did in the office. And all of my contacts were made that way. All of those kind of relationships you have that, like, oh, do you remember that night we went out and X, Y, and Z? I think it's quite different these days, partly because culture shifted. And I think that kind of like getting out of your mind on a Wednesday night is no longer seen as kind of all right. I mean, Empire, for example, most of the staff didn't drink. So when I turned up and I wanted to kind of bond with them, I took them all down the pub at 5 o'clock on a Friday, trying to be the cool boss, being like, you guys can have whatever you want. And they were like, Diet Coke, please. Diet Coke, please. And it didn't harm any of their careers. They've all not drunk for a long time. James, who's coming tomorrow, he drinks very rarely. I think the culture has definitely shifted. I think also, the way that things have gone virtual, so few events happening now. I think people have found different ways to connect and different ways to engage that aren't just about going to those events and parties. Whether that sticks and is a long-term thing, I think remains to be seen. But I don't think anybody these days would kind of be shocked or surprised if you didn't drink, for example.
Hi, Terri. As an editor, what do you look for if someone's pitching you an idea for an article? Because I've sent a few and not got any responses. So is there a certain way of structuring a pitch to an editor that will think, I'll read this story?
So the best thing, and I'll just do it really detailed, is in the subject line, just write pitch, colon, and then the working headline. Then in your email, repeat the headline, a 1-paragraph summation of your idea, including any access and interviews you try and get for it, any thoughts you might have on how it should be visualized, and then that should be it, apart from a couple of byline links if you have them. So it's really nailing the idea and understanding the angle, because so I'd get a lot of pitches saying, oh, I'd quite like to interview this person. Empire has a list of people they can use to interview people. What we didn't have is people coming up with brilliant, smart news takes, for example, for the front section of the magazine. And we would often ask for pictures, and we commissioned a lot that way, was just people getting in touch with us and just nailing it and being succinct in that kind of pitch. And it doesn't even massively matter if you've had tons of experience being published. It's just nailing the idea, making it something they haven't already been pitched 10 times, and showing you understand the title. So not pitching them somebody who's completely off topic. Or, I would get a lot of pitches for a film out this Friday. We're a monthly magazine. We work 3 months ahead. If you don't know that, it's too late for that, then you probably don't understand that Empire is a monthly magazine, etc., etc. So I think it's just the basics and structuring your pitch as I just described.
Thank you. Anybody else got a question? Oh.
Just a bit more of a fun one. I was going to say, well, part of it is not that fun. So obviously when you go to a lot of the events, especially with someone like Empire, where it's quite highly respected kind of publication, there's a lot of schmoozing and stuff, not that I've been, but that I've seen, of how do you kind of make sure that you're not, and also just if you're excited about something, how did you kind of make sure that you kind of separated yourself? And I've heard Empire writers talking about 5-star Attack of the Clone reviews, things like that. How do you get around that? And then also just what's the best kind of event that you got to go to outside of any magazine?
So I think it's because you're talking about, I suppose, the relationships between staffers and filmmakers and people within, and it's a difficult one, especially for a magazine like Empire that relies on access. So those filmmaker relationships are really key. But if they're perceived to be too close, then people will say, Kevin Feige's paying you guys £1 million to give 5 stars to the latest Marvel movie, which is obviously nonsense, but you do have to be aware of perception and trust. But there should always be checks and balances in place. So, for example, if there was a massive fan of a particular franchise or filmmaker, I wouldn't have that person review the latest film, because the perception would be of some kind of bias and favoritism. Obviously, you don't want to give it to somebody who doesn't like that stuff, but you want as much of a clean slate as possible, and for them to judge it fairly. So I think there are things all magazines do to ensure there isn't bias. For example, if somebody writes a cover feature on a film and interviews the director and loads of actors, then they absolutely cannot review the film, because if you've spent an hour and a half talking to a director who's essentially pitching you his amazing vision, how can you then, if you need to, write a 2-star review of the film he's just dedicated his 5 years of his life to? So I think you always need to be aware of the conflict, and hopefully you'll work with editors who can help you manage that, because it's as much for your reputation as a journalist as it is for the titles. And I'm just trying to think about best to do. Do you know what? I always hate those things. I'm a bit awkward, and I just find them like a bit cringy and I always feel a bit anxious before them. And I never know how to be around famous people, which is a bit, I edited Empire and I'd meet them all the time. And I always used to think, oh my God, I'm so awkward and weird. And they're just going, did she really edit the magazine? Like, I mean, that wasn't really my favorite part of the job, I've got to say. And I was lucky enough to go to some great things and, go to LA a lot to talk with the studios and go in the edit with filmmakers. But for me, the thing that always turned me onto the job, and Empire in particular, was how brilliant the audience were, how engaged they were. They were unlike any other audience I'd ever seen in magazines. They loved what we did so much. They held us to a really high standard. They were so active and they would tell us what they thought, both good and bad. And I love that. And it's a real gift as a magazine editor to have that. And I would sit and talk to the readers any day of the week over, an A-list actor who's normally just hungry, to be honest.
Perfect. Okay, I think that is all we've got time for. So I'd like to say a huge thank you for such an honest and also, I think, inspiring kind of account of your life. And so, yeah, keep doing the storytelling, Terri. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.